Welcome to this new episode of Frick 5. I am Xavier Salomon, the Jay Sharp Chief Curator at the Frick Collection in New York. And today I am joined by Arturo Galansino, who is the director of Palazzo Strozzi in Florence. And he's joining us from Italy with this online transatlantic meeting. Arturo is well known to Frick audience because together with Simone Facchinetti and Amy Ng, he curated the monographic exhibition on Giovan Battista Moroni last year at the Frick. And he, as the director of Palazzo Strozzi, has also been curating a number of exhibitions, not only on old masters, but mostly recently on contemporary artists. And he's done the great shows on Ai Weiwei and Marina Abramovic and Bill Viola, and most recently, the ones on Karsten Holler and Tomas Saraceno, which is on at Palazzo Strozzi at the moment, and hopefully will reopen soon over the summer. Welcome, Arturo.
Thank you, Xavier. Great to see you.
So, 5 questions for you, and let's start with the first one about what is the museum or the work of art that changed your life?
Yes, I would answer in another way. Basically, I think that was an exhibition that changed my life, because, and then I think it makes sense because of the work I'm doing now. One of the first exhibition I attended was the archaeological exhibition series that was done in Palazzo Grassi in the second half of the 80s, Palazzo Grassi in Venice, of course. And I remember very clearly the visit to the exhibition of the Phoenicians in 1988. I think at the time I was 11 years old. As all the children, I was passionate about antiquity. Then furthermore, as a Piedmontese, I grown up with the Egyptian Museum, really, close to my heart. And so for the first time, I saw the antiquity represented in a spectacular, big scale, a large production exhibition. And this, to me, was a revelation, because it was learning art history visually through the direct contact with the artwork. And furthermore, I remember that I was also very bad at the time, because I remember I touched the sculpture, and that was, of course, forbidden. So I had this shock first experience with a big art show.
So the nightmare of every curator and guard, the child that goes around touching the works of art.
It was a stone sculpture at the end,
It was okay.
Yeah, not too fragile.
So if you could live with one work of art, would that be an archaeological piece or not?
No, for sure not, because they are too fragile. I would be scared about that. And I would not like to live with incredible masterpieces by Renaissance, because they would be too much related with my work. And at the same time, I would not live with contemporary artwork for the same reasons, also because they are too expensive. They would be too expensive. I would be scared to have this Jeff Koons in my house and things like that. But I would like to have something more related with my hobbies and passions, not only the artwork. So I would like to live with the painting depicting Whistle Jacket by George Stubbs, one of the masterpieces at the National Gallery. As you did, I worked at the National Gallery as an assistant curator for a couple of years. I remember this masterpiece that impressed me a lot. This was the centerpiece of the British Room, for sure one of the highlights of this great collection. And as a horse rider and a question, this painting, of course, touched my heart also because of his history. The masterpiece by George Stubbs was commissioned by the Marquis of Rockingham, a very influential politician, a Whig politician at this time. We are 1762. And he was one of the great breeder of race horses. And Whistle Jacket, this horse, one of the first, was a champion. He became famous because he won a competition, a race, against a very famous horse at the time. It was called Brutus, another Arabian stallion. And so the owner wanted to have this this painting for celebrating this victory. And Whistler Jackson became one of the first Arabian stallion imported in England for creating a new race of sport horses. So it's really, this painting is not only a masterpiece because you see this incredible, this representation of the horse life size, a lot of naturalism on this flat background, but it's also important as an historical document of this switch in the horse breeding.
Now, moving away to other types of art, what is the book and what is the piece of music that has inspired you the most?
You know, of course, we had to cope with many books in our life, but for sure I have a long love history with Marcel Proust, À la recherche du temps perdu, for many reasons. This book reminds me my life in Paris. Of course, I lived for 5 years in this town, and many of the scenes described in this book could be still seen or imagined today living in Paris, in the urban landscape, or also visiting museums such as the Jacques Marandré or the Musée de Camondo. But my story with Proust started much before. It started when I was 10, 11 years old, reading the first chapter of the Recherche, the part dedicated to the love of swan, and which is a handbook of love. All the Recherche in a way is a handbook, is a manual for love, because all types of categories of love are described very well. It's a great book because it's a perfect representation of the historical representation of this year of the Third French Republic, between the Affaire Dreyfus and the First World War, and is much more than that. It's the most I think ambitious novel ever written. The Cathedral novel was called. And basically, it's a book challenging the perception of time. It's a book that wants to use the memory as a creative force, and describing a time growing, looking backward, and not looking to the future. And it's great in all the description. The language is great. I adore reading in French, so it's the perfect thing to do when I have some time. The book is always with me, also now on my desk.
I love the way you've chosen a very quintessentially English work as a painting and a very quintessentially French as a book. And of course, as an Italian, you spent a lot of time working at the Louvre in Paris and then at the National Gallery and the Royal Academy in London. So I love the way they reflect your European life rather than just your life as an Italian man. So what about music? I know we're going for something completely different here.
Yeah, that's me with the leather jacket. So it's my rock and roll, the rock and roll part of my soul. I would choose The Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd, 1973. This is really a pivotal album for the history of rock, of modern music, I would say, in a broader sense. It's the beginning of a new phase for the English band, and the beginning of I put it like the beginning of a trilogy, to me the perfect trilogy. So Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, Animal, and then The Wall, the great 1970s, one of the greatest 1970s rock production of all the time. It's a very modern album because it's rock and roll, but it's also philosophy. Literature is talking about existential and philosophical problems such as greed, time, death, alienation. The problem of modern time is an album showing the dark side of the human soul. That's also the reason of this title. So it's not just rock and roll in a way. Technically, it's a very experimental album. The music is just great. They started using multi-tracks, loops, synthesizer. There was this guy, Alan Parsons, was a sound engineer and was a big part in this endeavor. And when you listen to this album, you really feel this architectural construction of the music, and I think it's typical of the Pink Floyd. Actually, the Pink Floyd met when they were studying architecture in Cambridge, so there is a lot of architecture, I think, behind their output. And then the cover, the sleeve is just amazing. This image is really iconic, one of the most iconic image of the history of music. I have the T-shirt, of course, perfect with my leather jacket.
You should have been wearing your T-shirt
next time.
Now back to paintings or sculpture or art. Who do you think is the most overrated artist, and then who do you think is the most underrated?
Okay, so as you did, I studied and worked on Venetian Renaissance painting, as you know. Of course, I am a Titian fan. To me, Titian embodied the perfect painter in a way. I also love Veronese, as you do. And
good, I'm glad to hear that.
Talking with you, I must love.
I would have been very offended if you chose Veronese as the most overrated artist in history.
I must love Veronese, but sometimes in my career as a museum visitor and art historian, I had some problem with Tintoretto. Sometimes I find it a little bit boring, a little bit repetitive. You see that sometimes you feel too much the presence of his workshop, of his atelier, and how these paintings are often serial. Of course, thinking about some of his masterpieces, such as The Miracle of the Slave, such as the two paintings about St. Mark's corpse, or the San Giorgio in the National Gallery. These are absolutely masterpiece of all the time, but sometimes, especially with big decoration like the Palazzo Ducale one, the Paradise, I find it a little bit too much, a little bit vulgar sometimes, and as I said, too serial and repetitive. Doesn't impress me too much.
It's meant to be impressive, but it needs more than that to impress you. So what about the underrated artists?
Yeah, well, I'm talking with you, so of course, let's talk again about Giovan Battista Moroni. The exhibition that we did at the Frick all together was, I think this was an important show, like the previous one in London at the Royal Academy in 2014 was important too, because these two exhibitions wanted to show to an international public the importance of a great master of 16th century, and for sure underrated. It was underrated. Moroni was underrated since he was born, in a way, because already at this time it was considered underrated, considered a little bit strange in a way, too natural, too realistic. It was not fit to survive in a way, because it was really peculiar for its time. It's not comparable with the Titian portrait, for instance. But now I think is an important name to rediscover, because it's still very modern. I think is very unusual, and is very intelligent in his way of seeing and depicting humanity, and very psychological. If you remember the first, sometimes also very spectacular. If you remember the first wall of the exhibition with the lady in pink as a centerpiece, that was really spectacular, and everybody was a fan of it.
Yeah, she was a poster girl for the
yeah,
exhibition.
It was the poster wall, the pin-up of the exhibition.
She was the pin-up for sure. But I think it's true that I think both your first exhibition at the Royal Academy 6 years ago, and then the one at the Frick last year, really brought Moroni to the attention of an Anglo-Saxon public who had hardly heard the name before. And it really showed what a strong and fascinating and wonderful artist he is.
Yeah, funny enough, because as you know, Moroni is very well collected in the Anglo-Saxon world since 19th century. So anyway.
But surprisingly little in America, actually, mostly in England. I mean, the National Gallery has such a wonderful holding of Moroni. In America, there are some great ones, but not as much.
Yeah.
I always hoped and wished that Frick would have bought a Moroni, but
you have to.
Enough, you didn't. So
you have to fill this gap.
I need to fill that gap at some point, for sure. So final question, and since we're talking about portraits and beautiful portraits, I'm assuming maybe you would like to be portrayed by Moroni, but if not Moroni, who would be the person painting your portrait?
If I had to be portrayed by a great master, I would not choose Moroni, because it would be too modest. it doesn't happen every day to be, you know, to be portrayed by a great master. I would not choose Titian too, because I don't want to be too grand. I would not choose Rembrandt or Lucian Freud because they are too intense. You know, I don't want so much intimacy with my you know, portraitist. Probably I would choose Velázquez. He's a painter I always loved. To me, is the perfect painter, the best of all the times. Unfortunately, I never worked on Spanish painting. I never worked on Velázquez, but of course, every time I go to Madrid, I spend a lot of time in front of its paintings, especially in front of the portraits, which are simply spectacular. It was great in depicting the emperor, the pope, you know, the highest society of the time, but it was especially great in painting normal, poor, or more humble people. I think in his Juan de Pareja, who was his slave and assistant, probably one of the best painting of all the time. I would like to have a portrait like that for sure.
Oh, I can see you on an equestrian portrait. I think since you chose Whistle Jacket, I think it's fitting enough for a lover of horses to be shown riding in the countryside.
I would like to be painted like the Duke of Olivares, riding one of my horses. That would be amazing. Really,
that would be great. And I can see this life-size equestrian portrait being in the entrance hall of Palazzo Strozzi. I think it would be very, very appropriate. So thank you, Arturo, for joining us today. And I would encourage everyone, when we can travel again and you go to Florence, go and see the wonderful exhibitions that Arturo is putting together and putting up at Palazzo Strozzi. The Saraceno exhibition should hopefully be on over the summer and maybe later in the year. But there is a great program of contemporary art and old masters and wonderful big exhibitions that you can see there. So thank you again, Arturo.
Thank you.
Look forward to seeing you soon either side of the ocean. Bye-bye.
Ciao, ciao, ciao.